Hello, this is Steve Malone with CompassFX. Hope you're doing well today and you're getting some good trades. As a trader, one of the tools that we can use to target a potential exit in the marketplace is based on a pivot point level. Now, not only is pivot points used as a potential target or where we're looking for the market to go to, but also realize that a pivot point can also be the fundamental basis by which the market's going to work off of. If you're not that familiar with the pivot point, it is simply 3 price points from the previous day. The high, the low, and the close added together and divided by 3. Then there's other calculations that determine additional pivot point levels off the primary or main pivot point. Now what I want to share with you today is that oftentimes I've seen the market move 3 to 4 days in a particular direction off the pivot. Then we go through a transitional phase where we cross over the pivot and we look to trade potentially 2 to 3, maybe 4 days in the opposite direction of the primary pivot. Let me show you what I'm talking about. If you look here, we can see that the market here was kind of in this transitional phase. We went from below the pivot to above the pivot. And that's a little transitional phase right there. Then what we look for is the market to come back and test the pivot. Work off of it, come back and test the pivot, then work off it again. If you notice that as we work off the pivot, the market either hits or comes very close to one of the pivot levels. Here we come back to the pivot, then we reach the R1, the R2, and we hit the R3 for the day. We work our way back to the pivot, test a potential break for transition in the market. We don't get that transition, and then we work off of that pivot to the R1 level. Now today, interestingly, we opened up right at the pivot level. So the market could have gone either way, but typically what I find is that if the market moves 3 steps, I call it a 3-step market structure, in one direction, we look for that transition and a move in the opposite direction. So in this case, we went 1, 2, 3 up. We open right about the pivot level, and then we transition from above the pivot to below the pivot, and we reach to the S1 level today as we come off of it. Take a look at the dollar Swiss. It's just in the opposite direction. Here we were in a transitional phase right above the pivot, then we dropped below the pivot, went basically down to the S1, worked our way almost to the S2, and then came back. The following day, test the pivot, stayed below it, worked all the way to the S3, came back, test the pivot. As you can see, day by day, the pivot changes because we have a new high, new low, new close. Take the high, the low, the close, divided by 3, and that gives you the pivot. And we work off of it. Today was our transitional day, where we come through the pivot. We actually opened up around the pivot and then started working our way off of that. Now I know you may be sitting there thinking to yourself, well, Dean, the euro dollar goes one direction, the dollar Swiss goes the opposite direction. That's pretty easy to see. Let's take a look at a currency pair without either of those two involved. Let's take a look at the dollar CAD, for instance. We can see that the dollar CAD had a transitional phase right here. The day before, it was above the pivot, came back, tested the pivot, and then worked off of it. Then it had that transitional phase where it came below the pivot, went to the S1, worked back to the pivot, came off of it again as it started working its way down towards the S2. So here's our first day below, comes back, and was literally within about 8 pips or so of the pivot and came off of it all the way down to the S2, worked its way back towards the pivot again. Here's another situation of hitting the pivot, or coming real close to it within the spread right here, and then dropping back down. Now what we've seen today is another move down. Now my thinking is this. Now we could see the potential for the dollar CAD to continue moving on down, and some are estimating that it will pass through parity, which is 1 US dollar equal to 1 Canadian dollar. And we're just a few pips at this point, just about 16 pips away from parity. However, taking a look at the transitional phase being 3 days ago, if the market steps down 3 times, 1, 2, 3 steps down here, it's 3 days down, we may see the pivot drop back down, go into a transitional phase, and then possibly work its way back up towards the R1. So when you trade with the pivots, look for the market to work in the direction of the trend. if you're working into a three-step market structure. What I mean by that is if you open up below the pivot, there's a good chance that you're going to continue staying below the pivot as long as you're within that 3-day or three-step market structure. However, if you're pushing it to where you're about the 4th day in, look for a possible transitional phase where the market may open on one side of the pivot, but then we may close on the other side of the pivot like we did back here. We opened up below, then we transition to the upside. Sometimes you'll have maybe a day or two of transition where we literally are changing the direction of the trend. Here we were below the pivot and transitioned then above the pivot. So look for that. If you want more information about the pivot point and calculating pivot points, you can go to the CompassFX website. Also, if you're looking for a pivot point calculator to put on MetaTrader 4, simply go over to www.compassfx.com/trade/MT4 customindicators.com, and you can download some pivot point indicators there. Well, hopefully some of this information will help you with trading the pivot points. Remember, when you pass through the pivot and you trade a certain direction, the following day look for the market to test that pivot. If the pivot holds, then we look to continue trading in the direction off the bounce of the pivot. Well, folks, Steve Malone with CompassFX. Hope some of this information will help you out. Y'all make it a great day. Get some good trades. We'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.